Hello, and welcome to episode something or other of the Book Binge. I actually forget which episode it is off the top of my head because I don't have my notes up on my main screen. And that is because today we are going to be doing a ranking, finally, of all 12 of McCarthy's standard novels seen here in this stack. Stacked in approximately published order. There might be some slight inaccuracies in there, and I apologize if so. But yeah, like that's the entire point of this video. Over the last year or so, a little bit more than a year at this point actually, about 13 months, I have spent a little bit more time than I probably should have reading all 12 of McCarthy's novels and one of his plays and doing a few of those as rereads once or twice, and had largely a pretty good time. My opinions on McCarthy aren't always the most popular with a couple of the books. And that's part of the point of today's video, because to counteract some of my less popular takes on some of his more popular books, I also have plenty of his books that I actually really enjoyed to some degree, and I wanted to rank all of them since there's so few of them that it's actually pretty easy to rank all of them. Like I said, I'm going to be doing this as a sort of ranking. I have all the books here, but the ranking is more implicit because this video is actually going to be a tier list. Yes, we're going to be doing a tier list of all of McCarthy's books according to my opinion and my opinion alone. Remember that this is not any definitive ranking in basically any respects. I'm not saying that any of these books are good or are bad. I might say that throughout the video in a couple of spots, but for the most part these are just my opinion. They're not definitive. Take my opinion with a grain of salt because I'm not necessarily a McCarthy lover, and I'm not a McCarthy hater either. There are some of his books I really like, some of his books I really don't, and some that fall in the middle. Without further ado, let's actually talk about the books. First thing we're going to do in the list over here is we're actually going to move these non-novel items down into non-applicable, because I have not read The Gardener's Son or The Stonemason or The Counselor, and the reason for that is because there aren't audio versions. There's an audio version of The Counselor technically, but I'm just, for whatever reason, have absolutely zero interest, even, you know, despite the fact that I had interest in reading all of McCarthy's books because he didn't have that many and therefore it'd be pretty easy to do. I don't have interest in The Counselor, and then these other two just straight up don't have audio versions. And after reading The Road the first time, I don't feel like reading any of McCarthy's books without audio. So maybe if audio versions come out of these other two, I'll finish reading these other three. The Sunset Limited will also go down there for now because it isn't one of his novels. It's called a novel in dramatic form on this cover of the book, so like you could count it, and I have read it twice, so I will include it on the tier list, but I'll do that at the end. But because it's not one of the 12 main novels, all four of these things are going to go down in not applicable for now. And with those 4 items placed, let's actually go ahead and start with the other 12 books. We're going to talk about all of these in published order, basically, and that'll be the easiest way to do it. I could do it in the order that I read them, but it would take a little bit more time for me to remember what that order actually was. If you want to watch reviews for all these books approximately in the order that I actually read them, I have all of those in a Cormac McCarthy playlist on the channel, but that is neither here nor there. Let's go ahead and start things off now with The Orchard Keeper, McCarthy's first novel. And I'm going to go ahead and hover everything in this average spot until I decide, you know, where to place it based off of what my thoughts were. The main problem that I had with The Orchard Keeper is that it is largely a very forgettable book. I remember enjoying it enough when I was reading it, but there were a couple problems that I had. I liked the dialogue enough, but largely it comes down to the fact that whenever I think about this book after the fact, there are not any scenes from the book that I can actively recall in my head. There are a couple of things that always pop into my memory when I think of The Orchard Keeper, but those are actually all scenes from Outer Dark and not The Orchard Keeper. Because of this lack of memorableness, even though I didn't hate the book while reading it, that means it's going to go down to below average. A book that I didn't love, didn't absolutely hate actually, but because I don't remember a single bit of it, it just kind of falls in the below average spot. Next up is Outer Dark, McCarthy's second novel, one that has a couple of missteps, but I actually think of really, really fondly. I don't particularly love the ending of Outer Dark and the pessimistic view, the nihilistic view that it takes, something that McCarthy does quite a bit, but I really enjoyed following the characters. I generally enjoyed the style and the substance of it, even if I think that it is pretty thematically opposed to itself. There are some thematic sides of it that fall on that nihilistic view, with some other hopeful thematic ideas that really kind of conflict with each other. So if I were to give this a more honest rating, it'd probably fit a little bit more in the average spot. But I think of this one really fondly, and like I said, the character journeys, the things that I did like about this, end up putting it in above average. If I were to have given this a rating right after I finished it, it would actually probably have gone so far up as great. But because of the conflict of thematic ideas within the book, it's going to fall right there in the middle of above average for me. Next up, we have Child of God, McCarthy's third book, which is kind of a weird one to talk about in a number of regards, but largely because it is definitely the biggest trigger warning as far as McCarthy's content is concerned, yet I didn't really have a problem with it. The character study that Child of God is regarding Lester something or other. The main character's name is Lester. I forget his last name. I always do. But this character's actions and his life, the journey that he follows in this book, is one that, like, I find myself, I shouldn't have enjoyed, really. I really shouldn't have enjoyed this one, and I shouldn't find aspects of it funny, but it is actually pretty humorous in certain regards at points, and it is a good character study of a really deplorable character. So it is definitely something that definitely falls in the above average spot. I would say that Child of God is a better book than Outer Dark, because Outer Dark is, like I said, conflicted in its themes, whereas Child of God is pretty solid in what it's doing and doesn't really stray from that. I don't love the ending of Child of God. I would have preferred to see it go a little bit of a different direction. But overall, the book is better than Outer Dark. I'm going to rank it below Outer Dark, however, because I prefer Outer Dark and I think of Outer Dark more fondly. Next up, we're going to talk about Sutri, which I described in my review of the book as being the most average book I have ever read. There are a lot of aspects to this book that are great. There are aspects to it that are super unmemorable. When it is great, it is super memorable. It is super great. But when it is not, it is just wasting a little bit of time. It is McCarthy's longest book and kind of suffers for it. It's largely slice of life, so the lack of plot and drive in it just means that it doesn't really have anything to say except for when it has certain moments that are kind of funny or humorous, or a couple little bit more emotional moments. There are parts of Sutri that I really like, and then also a lot of parts of it that just I didn't feel like were necessary. So it falls right in the average, the middle of the road for McCarthy, the exact, well, in far of like ranking what falls above and what falls below, I don't know if it's the exact middle of the road. It's kind of hard for it to fall in a spot like that because of 12 being not very evenly distributed between one in the middle, if that makes sense. So inevitably, either the great side or the not great side is going to have more books in it than the other. But we'll kind of talk about that at the end. Like I said, Sutri is one of the most average books I've ever read, so it falls pretty solidly in average. It is the average for McCarthy, and that is where it falls. As a spoiler alert, nothing else falls within the average of McCarthy's bibliography. Sutri is basically the one that I just put right in the middle there because that's where it makes sense. Next up is Blood Meridian, a generally considered fan favorite of McCarthy's novels that, well, a lot of people considerably like it. A lot of people consider it his magnum opus. A ton of people would put it here. I don't agree. And to, avoid getting upset, I will just basically say I didn't really connect with it. I liked the first few chapters quite a bit, but after like the first half of chapter 4, it became a little bit too boring and repetitive. I didn't find Judge Holden as a villain very compelling or interesting. I found his philosophy very lacking. I just thought that he was a middle school era bully, using his very minute intellectual superiority to bully people stupider than him into doing really awful stuff. And I didn't find that super compelling. So for me, it was not a great book. It was not very enjoyable. I actually feel like I should have DNF'd it after chapter 4. And definitely by chapter 5, when I got through that, I was like, it got pretty repetitive. One of my friends, Patrick, actually said, yeah, it's probably not going to change your mind. And he was absolutely right. So I'm inclined to agree. If you're someone who tries Blood Meridian and you love those first 5 chapters completely, it might be a book for you. If you get to the end of chapter 5 and you're already starting to fall off the hype train, you might very well be like me and not like it. So for me, I'm putting it in dumpster fire because I will never read this book again. And I would rather read my second least favorite McCarthy book 50 times in a row with no sleep before reading Blood Meridian again. Next up is the Border Trilogy, which was the third thing by McCarthy that I read after having read The Road and then No Country for Old Men. So we're coming up on the latter half of his bibliography here. All the Pretty Horses is the first book in the trilogy, and one that I have I have kind of a love-hate relationship with this novel. It's largely because there are some great and memorable things about it. I would say the character conversations and the dialogue of this are really great. In fact, there are a couple conversations in this book that happen that still stick in my head to this day. But in terms of like the actual plot and the drive of it, I didn't find myself super connected with the stuff. I didn't find myself very connected with the main character Posse. I liked it when it was a trio, but when it was just a duo, I didn't really like it. Also, the action in it is not particularly great. In fact, action is probably one of the things that McCarthy writes the worst. His storytelling side of things is a lot better than his, action sequence telling, we'll say. So All the Pretty Horses is one that, like, I feel like I should like more than I do. But I end up just, I think of those 2 conversations that are in there that I love really fondly, but everything else is like, it's just kind of okay. So it's going to go below average because I like Sutri a little bit more. But All the Pretty Horses is going to be at the top of the below average category. I suspect that on a reread, I could enjoy All the Pretty Horses and have it probably above average. But I don't feel like I'm going to take the time to actually reread that. I don't feel like it's entirely necessary. Next up is going to be The Crossing, which is a very, very good book. I know there are some of my friends who find it to be a little bit long. I think it's McCarthy's second longest book, just behind Sutri. So some of the aspects that McCarthy can get a little bit caught up in when he's, writing something long kind of show through. But I loved basically everything about this book. I loved the tragedy of it. I loved Billy as a main character. I loved his journey. I loved how that journey was cyclical. Happened basically several times, the crossing back and forth over the border of Mexico and the various different things that those journeys entailed. The conversations he had with people were great. The emotional moments were great. I really loved basically everything about it. In fact, this was one of my first very in-depth reviews that I wrote on Goodreads, and a lot of that was motivated by how much I really loved the tragedy of it. So The Crossing is going to be the first McCarthy book in here to fall in the great. I loved The Crossing. In fact, it was in my top 3 Cormac McCarthy books for quite a while. Cities of the Plain, however, is one that I should give another chance because I don't know if it was circumstances, just kind of being busy, and my mind just being on other things and traveling at the time that I was reading this one, causing it to fall a little bit lower. But it is one that I feel like was very unmemorable in most regards, but where it wasn't unmemorable were things that did not hit me very emotionally when I feel like they should have. There were a lot of things about this book that felt like a little bit too relatable in certain ways, and I'm not going to specify why, but there's certain aspects of it that reflected a portion of my teenage years in ways that should have hit me a little bit more emotionally, especially the big emotional review should have had a lot more of a gut punch than it ended up having. This is one that I should have liked just as much, if not more than The Crossing, actually, but ultimately did not connect to in any way, shape, or form. So it's actually going to go in dumpster fire because solely because of how much McCarthy missed the mark. Like I said, it's a book that should be a favorite of mine by all conceivable metrics. It should be one that I love, but I forget it exists. I just completely forget it exists. So that is how I currently feel about it. Similar to All the Pretty Horses, I think Cities of the Plain is one that I would actually like a lot more on a reread, kind of knowing what to expect and putting myself in more of an appropriate mindset to accept it. But yeah, it just didn't really work for me. No Country for Old Men was the second McCarthy book that I ever read. and was the reason that I decided to read the entire bibliography as a whole. So that kind of says something. I really liked No Country for Old Men. After reading The Road, No Country for Old Men definitely changed my mind on McCarthy in a lot of ways. It's a very good book, and I decided to reread it to cap off my entire McCarthy journey because I felt like that would be worth it, being able to experience it again. This has a super great emotional moment and reveal, basically. Not really a plot twist necessarily, so much as it is just a reveal that, like, I saw coming, like, 2 pages before it actually happened. I was like, no way McCarthy's going to make that the case, and he made it the case, and it just hurt. Chapter 9 and 10, I believe. It's one of those 2 chapters. It might be chapter 8, I forget. Somewhere in there. It hurts. It hurts my soul and my memory. But basically everything about this book is great. It is one of my only 5-star McCarthy ratings. So I'm going to put it at the top of the great. Next up is going to be the first McCarthy book that I read. That was The Road, and one that I did not really connect to super well. If you were to watch my first review of this book, the first McCarthy review that I ever did on the channel, you're probably going to find me putting it down here in Dumpster Fire, probably just above Blood Meridian. But that's actually not quite the case anymore. I did decide to do a reread of this, ironically right before I did Blood Meridian, to kind of give it a second chance, because the first time I read The Road, it was with my eyeballs only, with the physical book, and that was it, and it irked me in a lot of ways that I was able to avoid by doing immersive / audio only reads for all of the rest of the books. On account of that, I felt like it would be unfair to put The Road in any sort of ranking or compare it to any other McCarthy book, given that I experienced it in a different format. I was like, okay, I should probably experience this one in the same format as all the rest, so I have kind of a similar concept and perception of all of them in accordance to that. And the reread definitely helped me appreciate it a little bit more. I can't say I loved it on the second time either, but I definitely didn't hate it anymore. So I'm probably going to put this at the bottom of below average because it's kind of still in that regard, but it is one that I think of a little bit more fondly now that I did do the reread compared to the first time when I thought it was absolute trash, dumpster fire with only a couple of scenes that were any good. This time around there was a lot more of it that was pretty decent, and a lot less of it that I outright hated, but it still kind of falls in this below average spot. Actually, I'm going to adjust this. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and put this above The Orchard Keeper because I still just don't remember The Orchard Keeper really at all. So even if I dislike The Road in certain regards, it's pretty memorable. The scenes are all kind of stand out to me, especially after the reread, having experienced most of those scenes twice. It is a memorable book, and The Orchard Keeper certainly isn't. So yeah. And to talk about the elephant in the room, you see that there are 2 novels left, and there's nothing left in magnum opus. Well, if you've watched any of my reviews, you probably know that that's because I think The Passenger and Stella Maris is easily McCarthy's magnum opus. It is by far the best thing he has ever written, and is so good that I had to write reviews for them on Goodreads that do not fit on the Goodreads platform. If you don't know, Goodreads limits the review lengths on the website to 18,800 characters, which for my writing is somewhere right around 2,600 words or so. I think my review of Stella Maris is right around 3,000 words, and my review for The Passenger is like 8,000 words. I forget off the top of my head. The two of them combined together to being basically exactly 10,500 words, so they're pretty lengthy. Because of that, I could not actually post my full reviews of these 2 books on Goodreads, and the reason they're so long is because they really worked for me, and I felt like I had to like go in and analyze them to a degree that I hadn't even with like The Crossing. In a way, it was almost a full circle moment because they were so powerful. They ended up being the last McCarthy books that I had to think about because I hadn't finished the reviews yet, even by the time I was done with the rereads and the other reads of everything else. It took me quite literally about 2.5 months to complete the writing process for these 2 books, at least 2 months after I initially read them. So I don't really know what else to say about them because they mean so much to me. They worked so well for me that I can't really say anything more without kind of going into spoiler territory. If you want to know how I feel about these books, the Goodreads reviews of them contain the introductions and conclusions of those reviews, basically, that are all spoiler free. Or alternatively, I do have a review on the channel of these 2 books that isn't in my normal kind of on camera review format. Those two are actually basically a video essay. It's an over an hour long video essay that I decided to do because I combined the two reviews together based off of my reading speed. It made sense that the review, reading those two reviews in full, would end up being over an hour long. I never thought that I would end up writing an hour plus long video essay for anything that wasn't maybe like The Last of Us, my favorite video game, but these two books definitely called for it together, and I'm really grateful that I read them. These two books are so good that it made all of the rest of the McCarthy journey for me worth it. No matter how much I disliked the road the first time around, no matter how much I will probably abhor the Blood Meridian for the rest of my life, these two books made reading everything by McCarthy worth it. Like, they genuinely did. I loved them so much. So if you've read these books and you're not afraid of spoilers, definitely check out that video essay that I did, basically praising them all to high heaven. I love these two books so much. They made McCarthy worth it for me. So that is basically it. That is my ranking. You'll notice that Sutri here is still an average, and that there are 6 books above it, and then 5 books below it. So actually, when it comes down to it, even though I seem like a McCarthy hater with some of the things that I say, I liked more of his books more than I did dislike them, if that makes any sense. But now that we're at the end of this here, let's actually go ahead and put the Sunset Limited in here. Like I said, I read this, and then I did it a second time a little bit later. I would put this at the bottom of great. I really like the Sunset Limited. I would like it more if the ending went a different direction. I think it's a little bit too dismal for my taste. I wanted to see it go something a little bit more positive for McCarthy, but even so, the dialogue of it is great. I love the Sunset Limited a lot. So when it comes at the end of this, 13 McCarthy stories that I read, only 5 of them would I consider leaning more bad than good. 1 of them is average, and then 7 of them fall in good to amazing. These 2 books actually fall probably amongst my favorite books of all time. The Western Family Duology, Stella Maris and The Passenger together, and are definitely going to be in my top favorite books of 2024. So that kind of gives you a view of how I feel about McCarthy. If you're interested in ranking some of these books yourself, definitely give me a shout in the comments and tell me how you would rank all of these books. Keep in mind, it goes from right to left in terms of like worst to best. So if you were to take the ranking, The Passenger is probably my favorite book, but these 2 are basically one thing, so I count them together as one. But everything from No Country for Old Men to the right, and then down and right, all the way through Blood Meridian goes from, you know, the 2nd place spot essentially through the 12th place spot here. So thank you for watching this video. I hope I didn't anger too many people with this ranking, but I hope this ranking also kind of puts into perspective that I did actually really enjoy quite a bit of what McCarthy did, and that I'm not a complete hater of his work. But, you know, if you're convinced that I'm a hater of his work, it probably didn't really matter if this ranking was done or not. But regardless, if you did watch this video, I appreciate you for doing so. I'll be back in the next video, whatever that might be. I appreciate you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.